Okay. All right, well, welcome back. It is the home stretch, everyone. I hope everyone's prepared to do a run through the briefings today. As I put out in the last note, we're really thrilled to have Safi Bahcall join us and provide some of his big ideas, to use Steve Blank's vernacular. But before we turn it over to Safi, I want to give a chance to welcome some of our special guests. And in keeping with the class tradition, we'll let them introduce themselves, but they're going to be able to provide some feedback for your briefings today. And if we can lean on them hard enough, maybe even some follow-up feedback as you put your final brief and paper together. But Leo, why don't we start with you?
Hi, thanks a lot. My name's Colonel Leo Liebreich. I'm a U.S. Army Colonel, Special Forces. In my operational phase, I was a Special Forces team leader, and now, having worked for DASD Felter, or former DASD Felter at the Pentagon, I'm more in the policy realm, and I'm heading out to Indonesia to be our senior defense official out there in a couple months. And most of my experience has been in Indo-Pacific, working with partners. Over.
And Leo was on campus last year as a military fellow and a big part of our last Hacking for Defense iteration, and a lot of time in the Indo-Pacific region. So thanks for joining us, Leo. I see Glenn Tifford. Thanks for joining us with your awesome background, who's all things Taiwan. Maybe over to you.
Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Glenn Tifford. I'm a Hoover Fellow, and I manage their program on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region and on China's global sharp power. So I'm a civilian, no military background, but definitely work on Taiwan security issues and Taiwan and the region in general. So I look forward to this.
Thanks, Glenn. And I wouldn't confirm or deny that Glenn didn't have a whole lot of lead time before he graciously volunteered to join, but I think he's relevant for all the groups given the scenario, but we'll have him assigned with Steve Blank's group. And our hero from OSD, Owen, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Professor Felter, you look a lot more tan than you did in the Pentagon for those 2 years. But my name's Owen West. I was in the Marine Infantry, traded energy futures for Goldman Sachs for 20 years, and then joined General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, as his assistant for special operations.
Thanks, Owen, and special interest in misinformation. So we're going to link him up with that team, and I appreciate your support for the class. We're going to have Herb Lynn join us later, and he'll be linking up with the groups that have a kind of cyber focus. But he's in a call right now. And did I miss anyone else of our special guests that we recruited? I know. Okay. We'll get right into it. As promised, we're real privileged to hear from Safi Bahcall, who's really been a great supporter for our class. And since we started, we had a great conversation with him and with Steve Blank, and it was just some big ideas going out there. But you're familiar with his work and his War on the Rocks piece and this video link we shared. Read his background as a past, just a real life prodigy. You went to Stanford of the East for undergrad and actual Stanford for his PhD. So we're thrilled to have you back with the class, Safi. And you got to read his book, Loonshots. Check out the subtitle, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries. So a lot of big ideas that he's going to share with us. And Safi, appreciate you joining us. And we'll have time for a little bit of questions with Safi before we go into breakout rooms. But over to you, Safi.
All right. Thanks a lot, Joe. And thanks a lot, Raj and Steve, especially Steve Blank, for inviting me to, as he wrote a few months ago, lurk in the back of the class. I have spent a lot of time on a lot of campuses, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, Caltech for a couple of years. And I've never seen anything like this class. It's absolutely remarkable. The level of speakers that you're getting, the number of secretaries of defense, 4-star generals, military leaders, political leaders. It's phenomenal. And from everything I've seen in the time that I spent with leadership in the different service branches in the intelligence community, what you guys are doing is just such a great service. So kudos to all of you. And those emails that Steve Blank sends out and puts together, it's just absolutely fantastic. So thanks for having me, and kudos for everything all three of you and all your instructors are doing. And I should also start by saying what I told Steve by email a few days ago, that I just finished reading his excellent Secret History of Silicon Valley, which you can find online. And I noticed that he got started down his journey when he was 19 in Thailand and curious about where electronic warfare came from. And he kind of followed a winding path to what he currently does now, which sounded familiar because I got started also by curiosity when I got called and asked to work with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors about 10 years ago. And on the first day, the chairman of that group stood up and said, your job is to write the next generation of the Vannevar Bush Report. How should the United States shape its national research infrastructure for the next 70 years? And I thought, oh my God, I'm in the wrong place. I don't even know what the Vannevar Bush Report is, who's Vannevar Bush. And the more I learned about it, the more I got really curious. What was it that Vannevar Bush did 70 years ago that helped turn the course of World War II? And the more I read and the more I studied, the more people I talked to, the more I realized that story was really not very well known. And in fact, many histories, popular histories, got it wrong. So I got more and more curious, and that led to a new way of thinking about organizations, something else that I'd been working on the side. A bunch of things came together, all of which was about essentially why the 20th century model of an organization won't work anymore, and what a new model should look like. And for profit-driven companies, the private sector that I spend a lot of my time with, it's a matter of P&L, but for mission-driven companies, it's a matter of life and death. So that's why I've ended up spending quite a bit of time with national security organizations over the last couple of years, because what worked for the last 70 years is not going to work for the next 20 years, next 10 years, and maybe not even the next 5 years. Because as I mentioned a few weeks ago, if you look back at the history of our conflicts over the last century, we started many of our wars behind, either in kind of the product or technology or strategy, and we caught up in time. And that model worked when battlefield advantage was primarily driven by hardware. But as all of you have heard about, and actually can read a terrific report by the National Security Commission on AI, the source of battlefield advantage is changing rapidly from hardware to software. And the pace of innovation is so much faster in software. And what worked for organizations over the last 70 years for innovating in hardware, when innovation meant better planes, better ships, better guns, won't work. That same pace will not work when your enemies are adapting and moving faster and faster. That's true, by the way, not just in the public sector or national security, but also for many private sector organizations. And actually, another funny thing was Steve opened his little history with a surprising call that he got. I got a call, I think it was last year. It was probably the scariest email I got. Email subject line, it said, the CIA is looking for you. I was driving, I nearly had an accident. And that started me down this kind of journey I've taken the last couple of years to work with a number of the service branches and organizations in the intelligence community. And what was a tipping point for me was, and I'll share a little story that Mike Fenzel, who was a speaker, I think a week or two ago, started with this story, what was a tipping point for him, which is I got a call actually by another speaker from your class, Admiral Selby, and he invited me to meet with him on a nuclear submarine to discuss how to organize the Navy better for the 21st century. And I hadn't met him yet, and we sit down in what's the wardroom, the kind of officers' mess room, the kind of tight quarters. He has his staff around him, and he said, "Oh, I love this your work and the stuff that you wrote. I've been giving it to everybody in the Navy. This is what we need to do." And I'm listening, and I said, I thought about what he said, and I said, the opening story in my book is about the discovery of radar and how so many histories get it wrong and credit England and Europe, but in fact, it was discovered in the US Navy by a couple of scientists in the Navy, and it sat there for 15 years before it was ever identified in Great Britain. And there was a kind of a pause, and I said, it was senior officers in the Navy that shot down that idea. Just a lot of pause, and I could hear some people like taking their breath in. And I wrote about the thousands or tens of thousands of lives that were lost because of that delay and what we need to do about it. And I asked, how do you feel about that? What was your reaction to that? Room got really quiet, and he just leaned in really close to me, and he said, "That was my favorite story in the book." And everybody laughed. And I was like, all right, this is going to work out well. And this is worth my time. And that's, I think, what was Mike Fenzel's point last week is you want to be doing something that you feel you can make a difference. And that's why I've gotten involved. And I have so much admiration and respect for people like all of the instructors in this class and many of the students in this class who have committed much, if not all of their lives to public service and to national defense. So I tip my hat to all of you. You have had, as I've been sitting kind of lurking in the back of the class for the last couple of months, you have had, I've seen great speakers on strategy, great speakers on invention, on technology. And by invention, I'm not using the word innovation because invention and innovation are totally different. Invention is having an idea. You know, when Robert Goddard said, I think we could, propel, metal tubes by exploding some gas inside them, and essentially invented jet engines, liquid fuel jet propulsion. That was an invention. It wasn't an innovation until you translate it into scale. And it wasn't the US that led that innovation. It was Nazi Germany with the V1 and the V2 missile and the Messerschmitt 262, the first jet aircraft. Invention is very different than innovation. Innovation is what you get at the end of the day. Strategy is not the problem. Invention, you've heard some great stuff about technology, is not the problem. Leadership is not the problem. People pounding the table about innovation is absolutely not the problem. And what is the problem is adoption, is how you design an organization to absorb new ideas. And I'll explain what I mean by that, and I'll give you an example. IBM. For close to 60 years, the IT industry was known as IBM and the Seven Dwarfs. If there was a superpower in that industry, it was IBM. There were some couple little competitors in the 80s. There was a little company in Seattle called Microsoft. And when they did their partnership with IBM, there were 32 employees. There was another little company in Santa Clara called Intel that was running out of cash. Little competitors that IBM completely disregarded. Is this sort of starting to sound familiar? Strategy for IBM was not the problem. Invention is not the problem. The Department of Defense has 76 innovation labs. IBM has 76 or more innovation labs. Invention, technology is not the problem. Leadership is not the problem. If you go to IBM's website, if you go to listen to any of their talks, they're pounding the table about innovation all the time. That is not the problem. But look at IBM today. It's not even 1/10 the value of a couple of its biggest competitors. It's not 1/10 the value of Microsoft. It's half the value of Intel. It's gone way, way down. Yet it's got leadership, it's got strategy, it's got invention. I want you to imagine a really big cake. At the top of the cake are some beautiful, sparkly candles. At the side of the cake are some wonderfully attractive, delicious nuts. That's what you have inside many large organizations. The candles are the leadership at the top, pounding the table about innovation. You want them. It's better than the opposite. The beautiful nuts on the outside are all the technology labs, the innovation labs. You also want them. It makes stuff tasty. It looks good. But the reality of our military is that 99.9% of the 2 million people involved are that middle of that cake. And if that cake is dry and crumbly, we will lose the next war. It doesn't matter how many candles are on the top. It doesn't matter whether we have 76 innovation labs or 176 innovation labs or 1,076 innovation labs. We don't want to be IBM. We don't want to be that cake. Now, there's a lot of people who sort of address that problem and think about that problem and ask about, why does this happen? And what's the one answer, what's the BuzzFeed list of 5 things you can do? And there is no magic wand, but there are some ways. They're not obvious. They're subtle. They're not what you read about glossy magazines. They have nothing to do with fuzzy words like culture. It's about structure. How do you create the right structure that helps with adoption? And I have to say, one of the things that I found very encouraging over the last couple of years that I've talked with leadership in military or intelligence is their curiosity about what's happening outside, which I think is a shift. I wasn't around 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, but there is an enormous curiosity about what is it that some private sector companies are doing that has worked well, that has allowed them to solve these problems, because these problems aren't unique to the military. You see them in the private sector. So a few companies have figured it out. Microsoft has done a very good job on it. Amazon has done a very good job on it. Google has, for the most part, done a pretty good job on it. When I sat down with Admiral Selby, that was actually one of his first questions. He said, we talked about this. We said, you know, Google at the time was doing complete re-architecture of their search. They'd built their search engine 20 years ago, and now they needed to transform the back end because it was out of date. You know, they're getting it done in, let's say, blocks of 6 months. And Admiral Selby pointed out to do something like that in the military would take us 6 years, if not 60 years. How do they get it done in 6 months? So we don't have time to go through all the kind of operational or nitty-gritty details. And actually, Alex Lubkin, who is a student in this class, I don't know if he's on this phone, reached out to me. And I spent quite a long time with him, and his commander runs the Naval Nuclear Lab, to go through in much more detail. But what I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of a flavor. So first, there are five, I'll tell you about kind of 5 common patterns that I've seen across the service branches. That's a problem. And again, it's not unique to the military or national security organizations. You see this everywhere. But what's important is, what are some solutions to these problems? And so I'll get to that. The 5 common patterns that I see all the time is a preference for big versus small. And a lot of previous speakers have talked about that. Bigger jets, bigger engines, bigger ships, as opposed to the very small changes that can make an enormous difference. Second, product versus strategy. There's a preference of things that you can touch, that you can handle, ships, guns, planes, as opposed to things that are much less obvious, much less shiny, much less glamorous, but can make an enormous difference. For example, tank was invented, as many of you may know or have read about, in 1918, in the mid 1910s, and it was used in World War I, but it wasn't the tank itself, the product, that allowed Nazi Germany to take over Western Europe in a matter of weeks. It was their strategy with the Blitz. It wasn't, the U-boats and the submarines were widely used in World War I, but it wasn't the fact of a submarine or the technology of a submarine that helped Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was the head of the German Navy, nearly win the Battle of the Atlantic. It was the Wolfpack strategy. So there's an enormous preference of product versus strategy. And again, that's actually very common in Silicon Valley, as well as the military. And it's a big danger for a lot of companies there. Number 3, a focus on technology as opposed to transfer. In other words, let's just get the cool technology, and much less energy and attention on how to deploy that technology. What's the spread of that technology? What's the traction? What's the feedback? How do we improve it? Number 4, a focus on prototyping as opposed to prototyping. Now, Steve Blank here was a pioneer of the kind of minimal viable product idea, but something that's really caught on, and it becomes incredibly important, especially when you're talking about strategy innovations, not just external strategy, how you fight external battles, but internal strategy. How do you win the internal battles against the barriers that are preventing adoption and innovation internally? What you want to do is identify those ways that take 1 day and cost $100 to get data, to test a hypothesis. And I use the word prototyping. It comes from actually a guy who I've become good friends with, Alberto Savoia, who now teaches at Stanford and was at Google before. But it's about, how do you get things done in 1 day and $100? How do you test hypotheses incredibly fast? Forget the MVP, forget the minimum viable product. It's not a product. You're collecting data. You're establishing hypothesis and getting data. And number 5, minimizing versus maximizing risk. There's a focus on minimizing versus maximizing risk that's widespread. And that's the case, I find, much more broadly. I actually spend quite a bit of time with hospitals as well as military national security. And the advantages and disadvantages of working with a mission-driven organization are the same. And it leads to this problem of focusing on minimizing versus maximizing risk. And that's that lives are at stake. Whenever lives are at stake, there's an enormous and absolutely understandable focus on minimizing risk. In a hospital, you don't want to give 5 grams when you meant 0.5 grams. In the military, you don't want a lot of risk in your parachutes or in your nuclear silos. Yet, if you want new inventions, if you want to discover a new technology before your competitor, you've got to fail. You've got to fail a lot. And there's an enormous culture against failure, enormous processes and systems that penalize failure. So those are the 5 kind of common patterns that I've seen. And, very quickly, just tip of the iceberg, 3 things you want to do and that have worked in other places. And I'm not going to talk about reforming the acquisition process, which does need to be done, but it's like turning a battleship, turning an aircraft carrier. It's very, very slow and very painful. I'm going to talk about some things that are easier to do. Number 1, measurement. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So often I'll meet with executive teams or even military leaders or intelligence community leaders, and they say, oh, we want to get better at innovation, help us get better at innovation. We're not really good at it. And I say, how do you know? How do you know you're bad at innovation? What are you measuring? You're supposed to be a data-driven organization. You're supposed to be a fact-driven organization. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Now, how you do that, there's kind of an art and a science to it that we can talk about maybe later if there's some time. But there are very creative and clever and kind of easy ways you want to measure innovation, and that's important to get done. I remember talking with someone at the Joint Chief of Staff and said, we have no way of measuring and knowing how we're doing in innovation across the service branches. Absolutely no idea. Can't measure it, you can't manage it. Can't talk about getting better if you can't measure it and know if you're getting better, number 1. Number 2, rewards. I actually brought some quotes from the class. Actually, this was from outside the class. This is a major in the Air Force. You get promoted in the Air Force by not screwing up. Trying something new means risking failure, scaring people around you, and therefore risking advancement. Do what the guy did before you and train those below you to do what you do. Incredibly common, as all of you, I think, know. And there was a quote I wrote down from Michael Sulmeyer, who was in Cyber Command. And I don't want to take this too much out of context, but he made a joke. He said, and then I wrote this report, and let me tell you the number 1 rule of writing a report and promoting something here. The number 1 rule is don't get fired. And, everybody laughed. But the thing about a joke is there's always truth in a joke. Now, just imagine that. If you have that widespread view, the number 1 priority is don't get fired, how much risk are you going to take in the group that you want to take risk, the people establishing, searching for new technologies? Now, the final thing, and I know I'm going really fast, but I just kind of want to get this out there so that if there's questions, people can follow up in the chat or email me later. You can email the instructors. They have my email, and we can set up time afterwards to talk. And I think this one is the one that I feel most passionately about, and I wrote about, and that is special forces. There is a widespread failure to understand that being an inventor and being a champion are 2 enormously different skill sets. I mentioned the idea of radar was discovered by a couple of great scientists in the Office of Naval Research 18 years before World War II started. They were great inventors, but lousy champions. It took a guy named Admiral Parsons, Deke Parsons, who pounded the table of every bureau chief, boom, 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 just to get a check for $5,000 to get it funded. Robert Goddard, I mentioned earlier, great inventor, lousy champion. In the last class you heard, actually from General Shanahan, you heard about I think he called him a bullheaded colonel named Drew Kukor, who'd been pounding the table to make Maven and Jake work. He's the most recent in a long line of people like Deke Parsons or Vannevar Bush or Schriever on ICBMs or Moffett on aircraft carriers or Rickover of course, on a nuclear navy. What we need is a new functional combatant command, like cyber, like special operations. It's a surgical strike, not on the external battles, but on the internal battles. Why? For the exact same reasons we need special operations. It is a completely different skill set for a problem that's endemic to our services. That skill of championing an idea is absolutely not trained for today. It's absolutely essential. Radar was late for 18 years and cost thousands of lives because we didn't have that skill set. The idea of hoping that we'll find another disruptor and praying, let's hire some disruptors and hope and pray that they will make change happen, is not a strategy. As I think Chris Brose said, hope is not a strategy. What you want to do is internalize that. That is a secret weapon to win the war, win the internal battles, create this functional command, make it neutral like Switzerland so they can play important mediator roles. They're not another innovation lab. They are the champions. They are the mediators. They go between. They need to be bilingual. They need to understand product market fit. They need to understand horizontal influence. How do you influence people over whom you have no authority? All of those are unique skills. None of them are trained for. That is how Google succeeds. That is how Microsoft succeeds. That the few companies that have figured it out, they have a special forces inside with a career ladder. It's not, there are of course tech liaisons. They are, I don't want to use the word too strongly, but this is directly from an officer in the Navy as just one example. They're just not taken seriously because they don't have the prestige, they don't have the authority, unlike special operations. What you will get is the ability to innovate faster and better, the ability to solve those internal battles faster and better, and even more importantly, the ability to attract, retain, and motivate talent. When I put that out there in the War on the Rocks article, I can't tell you how many emails I got from people who had left the military, at Kennedy School, or this job or that job, and they said, if that division was there, if it was as cool as Special Ops and, and SOCOM and JSOC, sign me up. I want to join that thing. Let's put up a purple rope and make it incredibly hard to get into. And then the best people in the Army will have enormous respect and they will be innovation champions Army-wide. That's my 30 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever it was.
Thanks. That's awesome.